Quick word to the audience here. Kentik is our sponsor today. This is a sponsored session. If you have not heard Avi present before, he is, I would describe, a nerd's nerd. He has been in the trenches with all of us and part of the, well, Avi, I could let you tell the story, but I mean, my understanding is part of your reasoning for starting Kentik was solving actual problems you had down in the trenches. So it's always made for a great angle on your presentations as you've talked through what you guys can do.
Thank you for the quick intro. Yeah, my background is back in 1992, I was getting ready to leave Temple University, and there was no way to buy dial-up internet access. So I said, I got a bunch of Sun workstations. How hard could this be? And luckily, the internet did not let you fail in the 90s if you're trying to provide access to the cracked den of IRC and Gopher and such. And so then I ran above net engineering, where I said, if only I could know what our traffic is, we could program the network and optimize. And then I went to Akamai because I saw that they did know what the traffic was and were programming delivery. And then after I left Akamai, I was shocked to find that my brethren and sisterin didn't have good solutions, and they all wanted to automate and program, and said, step one, let's figure out what's actually going on. So that's why I started Kentik. So I'm going to focus in the 45 minutes on some of the newer side of networking, but show how we can take the traditional approaches that we've taken to understand traffic and the impact, and in some ways, the cloud instrumentation for certain cloud providers and going up the stack to things like service meshes, which are like F5, sort of arguably network, arguably application, somewhere in the infrastructure stack, can give us great insights about how to actually run the infrastructure, and commiserate with those of you that have to support cloud with people that think there is no infrastructure, but they still get to ask you when the network doesn't work. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. I'm going to encourage interactive questions, and happy to talk not just strictly about Kentik, but about monitoring, and we can always come back and do another break sponsorship if necessary. So before I get started, I should have put this up. Please generate some traffic. Weaveworks, which is one of the container networking companies, has a great demo that you can put on top of Kubernetes. And SockShop, we did not modify it to put the Kentik socks in, but perhaps we will. So if you can go and generate some traffic, then we can actually stock you by country and AS and see some of, as we look at performance,
you actually want people to go to that URL right now, yes, and do things.
Right
because
now.
You want to do live analysis of traffic. Got it. Okay.
Exactly. Yes. So I'm going to do like 10 slides, 11 slides quickly, and then get into demos. And then we're going to actually see some of the effect of dynamically looking at performance on top of, in this case, GCP infrastructure on Google.
Excellent. So go buy some socks, everybody. I mean, you're not really buying socks, but go buy some socks. No, you
can't actually complete the transaction. If you notice the shopping cart's slow, that's because we added some latency so that we could have a good demo. But anyway. So a little bit about us. Network visibility delivered as a service. We're about half enterprise and half service provider. And then people like OpenDNS and UltraDNS and some of the infrastructure providers use us also, especially if they're very internet or cloud or data center centric. So we take a view that traffic is not just flow, it's not just logs, it's not just cloud logs, but things that go from place to place and reveal things about your infrastructure. Most of our data is NetFlow, SFlow, IPFix. We can get it from hosts or, as we'll see, on the cloud. I have a few hundred customers, venture-backed, and we're generally selling to and working with the people that run the infrastructure side of the house. Because as everyone wants to be like all the hot SaaS companies, most of whom are our customers, network is sitting underneath. And lots of things have changed. I won't make this all about this, but lots of different kinds of infrastructure and people programming their own and things that you depend on that are not yours. And as I saw heard you guys were talking about, sort of security being a part of that. And then if the security people turn stuff off because you don't know what it is, then that's an availability problem. And so how do you actually take the traffic and make it usable? Well, the hipster Utes like to talk about observability instead of monitoring. And that's sort of, if people want to have fun, Google network observability. It's actually an engineering thing, but it involves understanding the state of the system. And we've always taken the approach that you want to see all your traffic from all your networks. You want to be able to have the machines tell you what might be interesting, but leave everything available for humans, and then integrate that into your workflow, and most importantly, understand what that means. So in V4, arguably, I'm guilty of thinking that I could just know all the IP addresses on my network. In V6, and especially with the internet, unlikely. So we think a lot about how do we figure out what, for any given traffic or flow, what application it is, what user it is, where that traffic, what that traffic means to the business. I will say there are, in fact, some service providers that ignore alerts from overnight from customers that have revenue less than a certain amount. We don't tell you what to do to configure the system. You're allowed to do that if you want to, but at the same time, you're going to have on a dynamic network a lot of different kinds of activity, and you can't really pay attention to everything. So understanding context is important. The way we do that is we take traffic, as I said, from flow up to Istio service logs, PCAP. We can turn that into flow from servers and sensors, hypervisors, and then in the middle, talking about context enrichment. We'll sync with Kubernetes, which I will show you, so that as things are dynamically getting turned up, turned down, we know what are those workloads, what do you call them in terms of application service microservice. We can sync with Radius, DHCP to know what the user is, or Active Directory, DNS to look at site. And then what are people trying to do? It's understand what might be interesting in performance, availability, security. So there's an alerting system I won't get deep into, and then keep it all available. And I'll show you the portal and a little bit about the APIs in terms of how people do that, and then integrate. We did a very fun podcast with the Packet Pusher folks a month, 6 weeks ago about this. Everyone thinks that everybody is integrating. Everybody thinks that everybody's using all of streaming telemetry. I would say there's some of all of that going on, and a lot of it is very custom. At the same time, most of our SaaS companies and a lot of our enterprise customers are doing certainly some integration and a lot of workflow. A lot of incident comes in, let me look it up in all my systems, if they have modern open systems, and then what do we do with that? So that's a little bit about what we're doing on the background. We could talk a lot about the network layer. What I want to do is actually sort of challenge and say we think a lot, even as a networking company, about what else do we see in our customers? And we typically don't see appliances that are watching things with PCAP. And in the cloud, there's a lot of approaches for that. We're open to taking and working with that, but that's not what we typically see. What we typically see is people building their own with metrics, or using a vendor, doing their own with logging, tracing, trying to put all this together. And separate podcast, and again, we can argue, is it network thing or not, but I think in this world, we need to be aware of the other layers and be providing those folks value. But a lot of the people that use a lot of these other tools think, oh my God, it's infrastructure as code, APIs for everything. But our people we work with are the ones that actually still need to make it work. So if you look at the cloud native compute foundation, you don't see a lot of what we would call infrastructure. Infrastructure pretty much stops at server, but our view is that people actually need to be able to look underneath. Very quickly, a couple more slides, then we'll get to a demo. So in terms of cloud, what we saw when we went out and looked at it and we're talking to our customers is a lot of the traditional monitoring systems don't really take flow logs. Flow logs from the cloud, they're called VPC flow logs, generally were designed for security. So they're actually generally unsampled, which can give a lot of systems a heart attack. They generally just let you grep them. It's sort of like Splunk, was grepped for syslog, but made more usable. Most of the tools you could put flow logs into Sumo Logic or Splunk or other systems, but they don't have a lot of network context, and so that's been an issue. And there's some cool data you can get there, like policy and accepted, rejected. You can get, we would think of it as negative traffic or negative flow. So that's really cool to be able to take. But the first generation of Microsoft flow logs didn't have bytes of packets. On the other hand, there's actually some very cool stuff. I'll show you on the Google side. Google VPC flow logs are strictly better than every kind of NetFlow and SFlow I've seen. even though they don't have TCP flags. But for operational benefits, you get latency data and they're updated every 5 seconds. Again, that might give some heartburn to some of the more classic tools, but from a Kentik perspective, we like taking that data, and a lot of our customers have found that to be pretty cool and useful, I should say. We actually try to provide use in our profession and not just have fun with toys. Isn't that right?
Not just cool, but also useful, I guess, if you have to.
Okay. Yes. We could have an argument about spanning tree being cool. Or at least being, useful at the edge. And back when I ran AboveNet, I found, I don't even want to talk about what people did with proxy ARP over high latency connections and taking down when I started one shared LAN. So we won't talk about that. And so what are people looking to do, especially into cloud, as people dynamically provision things? So again, it's sort of a separate topic, but made even worse in cloud, as things are provisioned across regions, even between region traffic in the clouds is 6 times more than commercial wholesale bandwidth rates. There's a lot of margin being made on network traffic, and the cost can be pretty substantial. Security is a big issue because you have a lot of workloads, and I heard you guys talk about microsegmentation at the end. If you know what should be talking to what, then a lot of the security challenges become easier. At the same time, if you don't apply the right policies at the edge, you've just turned up infrastructure that has some of your assets that all the weirdos on the net can go talk to. And then performance, which not every cloud gives you performance data, but Google does, and we're working with people like Sysdig and Luca Aderi at NTOP as an eVPF on finding ways to do very lightweight host agents that will give performance. You can actually do better than in many of the corporate networks from cloud getting performance data, and that can be very cool. And so just very briefly, we look at traffic from your own data centers, traffic from public clouds is flow logs, but you can also do appliances and things like that. And now I will switch to the demo. So the first thing that you want to do is go write some code. No. The first thing that you want to do is think about what's your infrastructure and what do you want to monitor. And we can certainly look at some of the classic things like routers and switches and take BGP and pull them for SNMP and call them, put tags on them and things like that. But for cloud visibility, and I'm going to focus on Google, what we do is for Google, you can configure flow logs from a VPC. It's actually really easy. You go in and you click flow logs, and then in Stackdriver you say send it to the pub sub, and then what we do, and then you create a permission, and then what we do is we wind up supplying to the pub sub. So in this case we have flow logs coming from a bunch of VPCs that are set up with Kubernetes, which has the Weaveworks stock shop demo on top. And then once you get that all set up, you're ready to go. There's other things we could talk about trying to understand what the traffic is. You can actually do custom dimensions, which are like route maps that add in ASCII the equivalent of BGP communities. So if you have your own database of what you're provisioning, you can sync that with Kentik, and that becomes a column, and I'll show you some of this. Some of the ways that we typically configure around interfaces and things like that with routers and switches don't apply, but we wind up trying to make it all a consistent view. So in Kentik, we've got libraries of predefined sets of dashboards. All of the dashboards are actually set up as panes that are running over all the traffic in full resolution. So it's not roll-ups that you're actually looking at when you're looking at dashboards. And this is just an overview, a high-level trend view. So one of the big things that people often want to look at, and I apologize, my router is a little slow. My router, sorry, wrong decade. My browser is a little slow.
Quick clarification point. Avi, you said I'm never looking at roll-up data. Well, I got to be looking at roll-up data at some point, yeah? Or do you actually store every data point for how long then do I have data I can look at that granularly?
Yeah, so we actually store all the data at the sample rate that we get it. So it could be unsampled or it could be all the way back. And for typically 45 days, but customers can have it stored for years. We do store some trending data back for years if people are looking. We're actually just adding SNMP and streaming telemetry, and that's to be determined by our customers. But we store generally for 45 days, so you've got a full month look back, all the data at full resolution. And we have people that pull out, and you can get, it could be 50,000 flows per minute and pull that out. And everything, if you wanted to see, so we went from a dashboard to a view, you can always say, show me the API call to get the data or the chart. And as you, and I'll come back to here, but as you add filters and all that, a lot of our customers are counting on the fact that they can pull that data. But if you did only roll-ups and you wanted to do something like, say, change this query, which is looking at subnet name to zone to zone to subnet name, and add the source prefix in, and rerun that query. If all you had is roll-ups, you couldn't do that because you have to define these things in advance. So, okay, in this case, that's not very interesting. So let's look at des prefix.
So I'm looking at an interface. I've seen this interface before, so I'll just ask clarifying questions.
Yeah.
I am seeing a whole lot of metadata that you know about, or that Kentik knows about, that I can pull into a visual representation to get a sense of just how traffic is moving around. In this case, in my GCP environment, but it's being given to me in such a way that I'm actually looking at it zone to zone and cluster to cluster.
Exactly. So the nice thing about Google is when we get the flow logs from them, they actually auto annotate with what's the zone, what's the project, what's the VPC, and then to us, those are first-class citizens like prefix and port and AS and things like that. Now, we don't actually get BGP from Google. When we talk with them, they said, there is no BGP, we don't use BGP. And I was like, yeah, that's not quite true, but you just choose not to give it to your customers to see what your external path is. So we're thinking about how to deal with that. But all of those things, which from Google project, these become things which are annotated on every flow. Just like if you have Kubernetes integrated, then pod and service are annotated on every flow.
And now the mystery of what exactly is going around in the cloud and between different components of the cloud and in between Kubernetes pods, we can keep getting more and more granular, goes away because you've got flow records you can data mine with all the rich metadata in there that gives you an example of that.
Yes. And you can actually combine it with your traditional infrastructure. So if you have an application that's running across your infrastructure in public cloud or multiple public clouds, then you can bring all that together. When we started Kentik, from the very beginning, we had to deal with a few different things. We had to deal with people that had NetFlow v5 and IPFix. So some people that could see VLANs and MAC addresses in v6, and some people that couldn't. So we needed to be, I'd say, not fussy about nulls and things like that. And some purists would argue you can't do anything until you have full packets. And our view is you got to get something with what you have. And the other is we had to associate BGP routing, which is a very dynamic system which updates in real time. So being able to take things like what are the services and what are the users and augment it with something, it was a problem we had to solve for from the very beginning. And the fun thing about Google is it actually gives you latency data. So you can actually see interzone latency data if your system knows what to do with that. Now, if you put all this into a logging system, it doesn't know what a zone and isn't really looking at performance quite as much. But this is just one way to view it. But you could go down to the raw data and say, I just want a table of all the data, pull it out via API. You can look at the raw data. You can look at the data however you want. So you could look at zones, and you could add back in some of the dimensionality that we were looking at.
As in, Kentik has an API, so I can query the Kentik engine and pull data out.
Yes, exactly. So we have an API Explorer, we have an API Builder so that you can go and look at that, but we also let you use the UI as an API so that, apologize, the go-to webinar is taking a lot of my CPU here.
Oh, we were wondering, actually, Patrick asked the question if you were at a full 56K connection on your dial-up modem.
Actually, I'm running at 38.4 right now. So
There's a trip down.
Don't get me started about tech support for my 56K isn't getting full 56K, and I had to yell at Bell Atlantic because they provisioned a T1 as AMI, not B8CS, and you couldn't do 56K on a basically a 56K wide channel. So actually, what I was saying was not just our developers, but all developers of front end should have to use GoGo Wireless on a plane. Or if you don't want to be quite as tortuous, then our customer Viasat, at least you could use Viasat. But high latency is something that people should have to deal with as part of their development. So again, if I have a view that I'm interested in, I can say show the API call to get the chart or to get the raw data. And we have people that decide that they want to do that and just take views out. We also have a Grafana plugin. I didn't get it set up. So a lot of, again, if you want to let the cluster operators, the application operators see what's going on, then we have that people can set up. We also do alerting so that we'll build trends and look at patterns in performance or security and attacks, people scanning you, and alert you on that. And the alerting system as well, in the policy gives you the full flexibility to say any kind of any set of dimensions that I'm looking at, any kind of filters that I'm looking at, and then what it'll do is learn in that. We take a slightly antithetical approach to some folks in machine learning in that if you look across all your network data and you say just tell me correlations, you'll get like a sim level, 10,000 things that are interesting if you had nothing to do but look at interesting correlations. But a lot of our customers are saying, wake me up, automate, and so then we tend to look at performance by an application by a customer, or performance by a peer, or congestion across different parts of the network. And so we're learning, but only in relatively more constrained segments.
So Avi, just to talk about this from a value perspective, at the top of the list, it seems like, okay, one of the things I'm getting is this cloud service, which essentially used to be a black box, now I've got more visibility into, yes?
Yes.
Okay, and the second thing is with all this data that you're able to feed to me, what am I as a network operator supposed to do with it, given that I may have limited capabilities of what Google's gonna actually let me do with their systems?
Well, the first thing is you can go back if you're provisioning applications that are across zones and they're actually pulling way too much traffic, then you might say, what are the actual applications that those things are using, and let me cohabitate them. Obviously, you want to have PHA if that's what you want to design in, but at the same time, we see people running massive data crunching jobs between zones or talking to a database that's configured in one zone from a set of infrastructure that's provisioned in another. That's a big cost, and it can also be a big performance issue. So you're not needing Google to do anything for you about that. That's something that you have control in your orchestration. The other thing is, if you're running in a multi-cloud or a hybrid cloud environment, then there are workloads that people do tend to move back. Not just, I'm not going to pick on Google, but because the cloud may not have the right way to get to your customers that are accessing an application. Typically, we'll see people use NS1 or Synaxis or something that's a load balancer in front of their infrastructure, and again, take control of their destiny rather than just talking to Google. Or you may actually see performance problems that are affecting you where you might reach out to them for support. Generally in the cloud, if you're seeing a performance problem or something that you've said, aha, I can prove it, you're still better to just orchestrate the infrastructure away because it's just a different operational model. And then on security, often we see people seeing internet attack traffic coming in or workloads that are talking to things that you don't understand or shouldn't be, and then you're applying policy changes, locking things down when you see anomalous traffic that's firing up. The cultural question is, are we at a point where the infrastructure folks are talking to the people that are doing all the dynamic orchestration on top of the infrastructure? And that's something that We certainly see in customers that people don't always have that data to have that communication internally. So that's something that we see people working on.
Yeah, you sort of anticipated my next question in that, do you see customers sharing this information, like the network team says, hey, security group, take a look at this, or hey, application developers, take a look at this, and it gives them a talking point where they can start making those connections and relationships?
We do. We think about this a lot, which is this view or a view that looks at ASs is typically not going to be meaningful to someone that's a developer, where you might look at traffic or latency by an AS. So what we typically see is we have a Grafana plugin that just uses our API. So what the Grafana plugin is doing is actually composing up the same JSON input that our Data Explorer is and pulling that back and then putting it side by side with their other data. Because the application or cluster operator is generally looking at server and Kubernetes or VMware or whatever their other latency is. We think a lot about how can you provide that visibility there. What we actually do is we develop for service providers a white label portal, but for enterprise, we see a lot of people saying, okay, I want a subset dashboard, which is everything but this amount. I don't want people to go in and click and see communities and AS paths and all that. And then within that, we'll say, okay, this dashboard can be opened up to this set of users, not because you don't want them to see it, but more because it's not meaningful. Just as you may be interested in application latency, but not every waterfall diagram, because you're not really trying to debug at that level. So a lot of work to be done still, but we have people. What we see is we have a lot of people that open it all up, and then it's been a question of how do you get that to be useful to other folks is a big question.
Right. Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely. So I will go back to the presentation for just a second. Wanted to give one quick interlude and then go back to demo, and we'll go back and look at the sock shop. Hopefully people have been generating traffic, and then we can look at some actual orchestrated microservices traffic on top. And by the way, I would say that most of our customers that do what we would call microservices are actually medium services, just like most people that do big data are really sort of medium data in reality. In that we don't see many people doing 500 services to actually build their apps, but we do see people using the microservices technology to orchestrate whether it's 5 or 10 or more like 50 components. Generally, we don't see the Twitter level, thousands of different services, basically a service for every API call. We don't really see that. So quick interlude. If you look at most standard flow tools, and we get a lot of, hey, NetFlow can't do that. We say, well, yes, it can. You just need to make it have more context. Flow by itself is less useful. And we saw what Google will do in their logs, which you can get right from them, actually adds all that in. When we do the Amazon integration, we actually have to go pull from their APIs to understand this IP is in that VPC and that zone. But Google actually makes it easier for you. But still, if we want to pull in geography, threat data, or other kinds of things, we have to add context. And so to us, we always thought about that. How do we add more meaning to it? And to us, it's data from the devices, so SNMP and telemetry, routing data and birth data. Context includes things like geography and threat feeds and things that we build in. And then streaming updates to things like DHCP and radius authentication, 802.1x, any kinds of logs like that, DNS and things like that. So our architecture, which I showed a little bit of before, is always let's take all the flow in from the left side, and then add these columns. If you're a flow person, you think templates, so that we don't have to just look by IP address, but we can look by zone and things like that. And of course, we use flux capacitors to do that, which are just big in-RAM memory routing tables. And our goal is get all the traffic, put it all together, and then back in Kentik, we have a column store, which Ethan is that system that stores at full resolution. And then we also do streaming and learning over the same data, but at a little bit of a higher level. And so that's the system that's actually building aggregates and saying, I think there's a change here, but you always have the raw data to be able to come back and do that. So this, if you're building your own system, on top of Elastic or Splunk. This is the problem that we see people typically getting stuck at solving, and it's all software. Certainly people can build it, but it's a thing which also limits a lot of the classic systems that look at your network traffic. Is without this, you're just staring at IP addresses.
And just to be clear, so you're starting with flow, but you're able to add more data to it to get enriched data.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the goal, is what is the meaning of the traffic? So we struggle a little bit because we talk about semantics. Like, why don't people use Splunk for APM? Because Splunk doesn't know what applications are. It's the same thing for network. It doesn't. Splunk don't know network. I guess we'll make a T-shirt that says that. I mean, you could put the data in, but you're not going to aggregate it. You're not going to get a view that looks and makes sense to the practitioner in any domain. At the same time, you don't want to have a proliferation of tools that are specialty just for everyone. So how do you put all that together? Those are the two questions we think about. How do you add value to the practitioners, but how do you make it accessible to everybody?
And the keyword there is context. You're providing more context about what's happening.
Yeah, context. Semantics is a big word. Some people don't like that. Enrichment, but yeah, it's the context. What does this traffic mean to you? So I'm going to go back to the demo. I'll show you actually one thing on the context first in the demo, but we have the sock shop set up. Cloud native can be an infrastructure, which is running on dynamic infrastructure. I would argue it could certainly mean some of the, using white box and orchestrating it yourself, or using cloud as just other people's computers. But containers going up and down, again, we in the network world have had this issue for a long time, because BGP changes and you want to associate traffic in real time with it. DNS queries change and you want to do that. But in the container world, certainly looking at an IP address from 3 hours ago isn't helpful. So how do you tie all that together? Luckily, all of that is API-able. There's actually two ways that I'll share with people and that we've integrated with, people can do on their own. One is Kubernetes has an API, and then we have a script that just connects that to the Kentik API to push all those changes in real time for that enrichment. Second is, if you can go up stack and get traffic from the Istio service mesh, which again is one of those things that I would say we haven't seen our customers say, I'm going to remove all my hardware load balancers and go to service mesh. But almost everyone that we're working with that is looking at modern ways of running is playing with Istio. And what we love is there's a plugin that gives the network nerds the ability to see traffic with latency and the application context. How do you use that is another question. But again, your router's doing IPFix or NetFlow v9. Maybe if you're running ASR 1Ks, ISRs, can do things like AVC and NBAR. There's nothing in the Juniper realm that really does that. The Aristas don't today. So getting performance data from the infrastructure has been difficult, and so to us that's been a pretty exciting trend. Let's see if we got some sock shop demo traffic.
I know I put some socks in a cart.
Okay, here we go. Let's see if we have some geo. Before I saw US. Okay, we didn't have Canada, or we have some folks in Latin America. We have some folks in India. That's actually pretty cool. And now, because we're getting data from both Google and up from the Istio layer, we can actually see what's the latency by country, what's the latency by network. We can then drill in on that. I'll show you down to down to prefix. And then because we actually get traffic from, we have an Istio plugin that sends traffic to Kentik, we can actually see HTTP return codes and latency by path. So we're trying to start to put together traffic data, performance, network, and application. Our goal is not in the next year to do everything an APM tool does, but rather to point to it and say what some people call mean time to innocence. There is or there isn't a problem at the network layer or the application layer. So country, we're just turned up in the US. That's not shocking, but I'm actually a network person, so I might say, okay, well, I don't want to just look by AS. And it looks like I would say, actually, we could zoom in another way and just look at prefix. I guess what we want to do to preserve people's privacy, because PII, is instead of /32s, we'll actually look at /16s and /48s and say, let's see how many different prefixes, and then we can actually look at performance by prefix for people pinging us on this Google Cloud infrastructure to the Google. And so we can see from some of these ASs, what the latency and some of the prefixes. And again, I won't show the whole thing. Actually, we should do desc prefix. And just one quick note. So these are the flow fields that you're familiar with. What we're doing with context is, in Amazon's case, we actually have to use their API and use that enrichment system. In Google's case, they give us this. The geodata, threat data, things like that, those are all things that we configure, and then people can configure their own. Ooh, I forgot one thing. We just did add, it's on the Nanog list, RPKI, so BGP security. If people sign their routes, then we actually show, you can see the percentage of traffic going to things. You could say, what traffic would I be blocking if I enabled RPKI validation in BGP? And so I think
that's a separate conversation, though.
Yes, we can have that in a separate time. Well, and we had this whole thing because a lot of people don't realize BGP RPKI is origin validation. So every time someone talks to me about that, I say, what about BCP38 and source packet validation, which gets related to, people, what are the paths in the middle, and how do you validate who's allowed to transit your prefix? But that's a whole separate conversation. Okay. So again, I'm not gonna. We didn't pick out people by IP addresses, but we can see network and prefixes to latency. And if we had more time, we could get into that, look at it over history. So that's a very quick overview, very quick, and just some quick takeaways. And if we have time for a couple questions. We're not all going to get fired. I think you'll have difficulty getting hired if you don't know what an API is in the next few years. But someone's got to run all the API magic that lets people develop and deploy easily, and the network is critical to that. And understanding all the traffic with context is important so that we can do our jobs and really make sure that the network stays running and no one even knows that we exist, which is a whole separate conversation over beer or soda about how we do this cross education across groups. And not only your own infrastructure and your own data centers, we've seen a lot of enterprise that say, well, no one cares about me, I'm just running this stuff, and then it's going to be VMware. But I don't think anyone thinks it's all going to be only AWS or only Google, even for companies that are moving a lot to it. And so we still got to play, but you need to be able to understand everything. And the packet-based tools, we haven't seen really get dragged into the cloud. And the cloud native apps that are containerized and orchestrated actually give you, in many ways, an easier time understanding them than some of the traditional infrastructure, and can even shed light on things like performance into your internal infrastructure if that's where you're deploying your applications. So only had time to give people a quick tease. And if you like network nerd t-shirts, we have lead sysadmins straight out of NetFlow, ones and zeros. And I would encourage you can come in through our front door, but I'm also happy, email me, I'm happy to talk with folks and happy to take questions in the 4 minutes that we have.
Send those in on the interface if you've got them. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you some stuff, Avi. So you showed us some specific scenarios. How much flexibility do I have to just take bits of metadata that are interesting to me personally, and on the assumption you're parsing them, I can make my own dashboard presentation, whatever?
Exactly. So anything that you want to do, I just clicked on something that's from a dashboard. I can add one dashboard and then add that in. I can make it private or visible. I can save it. If I create a filter that is really complex, I don't have one at hand, but I'll pick on my old AS. So actually, I guess it's been reallocated. And then I want to either save a part of it as a filter and be able to reuse it, like we have my VPC network, we can also share it so that you could send it to someone, create a template, call it a save view, any of those things. We can also give you the API so that you can take the view that you have and be able to pull that data in, change the time, things like that. So it's designed to be very flexible for how you want to be able to view it and how you want to share it. The one thing we're not doing today that we debate with customers is the sensitivity of the data. We don't give people the ability today to come in so that you could share it with a customer without them being authenticated. So you'd have to email yourself a PDF today, that we're thinking about that.
Actually, that's related to another question I've got. I'm sending data to the Kentik cloud by default. If I don't want to do that, can I put some sort of an appliance on my own network?
Yeah, we don't love the term appliance, but paint it purple and call it an appliance. It's still just computers. So yeah, about 25% of our customers, sort of by traffic and revenue, want single tenant, and so that could be we run a copy of it, or we now have you could call it 4U 8-node, because everything we do is clustered. We're sort of more like New Relic than we're like AppD in that we say any way you want to consume is awesome, but we have a little bit of a big data platform on the back end, or a lot of big data. So yeah, you could buy equipment. The only thing is, it's bare metal. We're doing very high-speed scanning. That's how you can not do rollups. So running on top of SAN is not a great architecture for us.
Okay, so it's got to be a specific bit of hardware to make this work. Yeah.
If there are any nerds, we could talk about that. It's our biggest challenge is we don't want a hardware RAID controller because we want to trim on the SSDs. So getting some of the big name vendors to give you a JBOD server can be a little bit difficult. But yeah, Supermicro, HP, Dell, Cisco, we could do all those things. So.
Sorry, yeah, what about integration with traditional tools like ServiceNow if I need to get an issue that's popped up in Kentik into my workflow?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the alerting system, any of the insights that we have to reach out, we have ServiceNow, PagerDuty, email. We can integrate with some of the mitigation platforms that are out there, syslog, any of those things. Or you can come and pull back BGP and FlowSpec, or you can pull us via queries. So we have a lot of customers that will use ServiceNow when a ticket comes in. We'll reach out, pull data from Kentik, in generally some graphs, not the raw data, and then have a link back and integrate that as part of the workflow. Or if we see something that's interesting, we can reach out, make an API call, or stick it in Slack or PagerDuty or things like that.
Okay, great.
One more question. I think maybe a year ago, Avi, I might have asked you if there was a possibility that data being rolled up in the Kentik cloud might present a global or an aggregate view, since you're getting some awfully interesting data. Is that maybe something that'll happen someday?
That is in the works. You will see it this year. Our biggest challenge has been privacy. Yes. So we've had people that we've done it with ad hoc, but part of our data architecture is that we don't have God accounts that can combine that. So we have to get permission, and then we're building a slightly separate infrastructure. Otherwise, we'd fail security review if we put all this data together. But you'll see that, and it's starting with attack and then going to performance, because we see across 300 customers, and some of them are big global backbones or country backbones. So it's I'm looking at some traffic, what is it? But we have to solve for some problems, like, again, not looking down to prefix and things like that. We don't want to shame some people that are potential customers also, but on the other hand, if all they do is generate TCP38 violating DDoS attacks, then they shouldn't be our customer. So.
Then final question, is there somewhere folks should go if they want to demo it? Can they get a demo? And anything else, any parting thoughts before we head off to our next destination?
Absolutely. Go to kentik.com. You can sign up and send traffic from your own infrastructure on your own. It's just a free trial. There's some videos online, and if you ping us or for this audience, ping me, and I'll happy to connect you and talk a little bit, or just connect you to get a meeting set up, get a demo.